So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the research seminar series at Hong Kong Baptist University. Today, it is our great pleasure to have Dr. De Choudhury with us today. So as you know, that Dr. Munmun De Choudhury is an associate professor of interactive computing at Georgia Tech. Dr. De Choudhury is best known for laying the foundation of a new line of research that develops computational techniques towards understanding and improving mental health outcomes through ethical analysis of social media data. To do this work, she adopts a highly interdisciplinary approach, combining social computing, machine learning, and natural language analysis with insights and theories from the social, behavioral, and health sciences. Dr. De Choudhury has been recognized within the 2022 Web Science Trust Test of the Time Award and a series of awards from the other professional associations. And her work has also been featured in popular newspapers and press like the New York Times, the NPR, and the BBC. She also now currently serves on the board of directors of the International Society of Computational Social Science and on the steering committee of the International Conference on Web and Social Media, the leading conference on interdisciplinary studies of social media. So the title of her talk today is that social media supports or worsen mental well-being. Well, it depends. So without further ado, I'll just pass the floor to Dr. De Choudhury. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Celine, for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I know it's pretty early in the morning for all of you, so I appreciate that you could find some time in your calendars to join me today for my talk. It's my pleasure and honor to have this chance to share some of my work with you today. And as you can see from the slide, my talk asks the question, which is, what is the role of social media in our mental health and mental well-being? Does it help or support it, or does it worsen it? And as you can also see the answer from the slide, it seems like it's complicated and we don't quite know. And that is exactly what I'm going to tell you about through this talk. How do we get to this answer? So I'm going to walk you through a series of talks, and we'll try to mangle some sort of an answer, which is that it's complicated and it depends. And we're going to arrive at that by taking a holistic approach, looking at research investigations in many different contexts, in multiple platforms, in multiple populations, multiple forms, and conceptualizations of mental health. So before I get I would like to request caution and self-care strategies to any member of the audience, because there are going to be some presentations and descriptions of serious mental illness, self-harm, suicide, and so forth. The caution is especially for individuals in the audience who might feel that they could be potentially negatively impacted. At the European Organization for Nuclear Research, also known as CERN, you may have read in the news, back in 1989, Sir Tim Berners-Lee came up with the idea that eventually became the web. Initially, Berners-Lee's innovation was just intended to help scientists like all of us so that we could share data across what at that time was an obscure platform called the internet, a version of which was already in use by the US government since the 1960s. But because of his decision to release the source code for free, to make the web an open and democratic platform for everybody, Tim Berners-Lee's brainchild quickly took a life of its own. But from the beginning, in fact, Berners-Lee understood the epic power that the web would bring with it. That would include radically transforming things like governments, businesses, and societies. After all, if you think about the web, web-based social media platforms that we have today, whether it's Twitter or other social media, these are arguably playing a very significant role in facilitating communication and interaction among, let's say, participants of political protests. Protesters, we have seen through multiple examples over the past decade, they use social media to organize demonstrations that could be pro-governmental or anti-governmental. They use these to disseminate information about their activities, and they also raise global and local awareness of various ongoing events of interest. And what could be better examples of that than the Arab Spring movement from 10 years ago or the more recent Black Lives Matter protests? And then we have teens today who literally have grown up on the internet, right? And social media serves as a space where many teens, and if you think about marginalized teens, such as the LGBTQ youth, they in particular have found an outlet where they can develop their identities. Not just that, often called a social media sensation, if we think about the Women's March of 2020 that happened in the US, it actually grew from a single Facebook post that suggested that something needed to be done into a worldwide series, and that resulted in a worldwide series of rallies, demonstrations, picketing events around the world. In fact, within 4 short weeks, this Women's March that commenced in Washington, D.C., it became what may have been one of the largest demonstrations that ever convened in the U.S.'s Capitol related to any presidential election. But at the same time, Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, also envisioned that his invention could, when it fell in the wrong hands, could become a destroyer of words. As Robert Oppenheimer once infamously observed of his own creation, which was the nuclear bomb. Berners-Lee's prophecy came to life most recently when we got to know about revelations that emerged that Russian hackers interfered with the 2016 presidential elections in the US, or when Facebook admitted that it exposed data on more than 80 million of its users to a political research firm called Cambridge Analytica, which worked for Donald Trump's campaign. And then we have plenty of other examples to work off of. So these benefits and harms of the web were not just noticed by its creator, Tim Berners-Lee. In fact, many scholars over the years, they have been observing time to time the many positives that web and social media in particular brings, whether helping people's well-being during transition to college, helping manage major life events, giving voices to marginalized communities, or helping people with mental health struggles find peer support. But at the same time, we also keep on seeing news after news almost every day about Instagram, Snapchat, or TikTok causing mental health problems in people, online streaming services that glorify suicide, and parents and lawmakers throughout the world, they are increasingly concerned about how to curb the damages that these platforms are bringing about in teen mental health. So given sort of these two parallel trends of both positives and negatives, we basically can say that we have evidence on both sides of the table when it comes to the impact of social media on mental health. But then the question is, what is the truth? Is there some sort of a final verdict based on all of these examples of positives and negatives that we see around us? So in this talk, we will delve into this question a little bit as a step towards understanding or maybe reaching some sort of a verdict after all. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the positives, examples where we have empirical evidence right now of social media use having helped people struggling with mental health challenges. So emerging from the deinstitutionalization movement that happened in the late 20th century, if we think about one of the prominent models in mental health, that is the recovery model. And the recovery model has been the guiding principle of mental health policy in many different countries throughout the world. What it does is that it views recovery as sort of a personal journey rather than a set outcome, and one that may involve, let's say, developing hope, a secure base and a sense of self, developing supportive relationships, empowerment of the person, social inclusion, coping skills, and finding meaning. So in a sense, what we are saying is that recovery from mental illness is not just something that involves removal of symptoms and restoration of functioning, although that is very important as well. But importantly, recovery involves essentially the removal of stigma and negative stereotypes. It also means that these experiences of stigma and negative stereotypes need to be removed that result from lack of opportunities or result in lack of opportunities. And recovery involves finding a way of living a somewhat hopeful and contributing life despite the limitations that are brought about by the experience of a mental illness. So as people increasingly use social media today, the question is, are these platforms contributing to some sort of social pathways to care among those who are suffering from a mental illness? So let's start off with this work. So in this work, we were interested in the question of self-disclosure. So we think about the phenomena of self-disclosure, especially self-disclosure of stigmatizing conditions. It is actually known to yield therapeutic benefits. Social media today, as they're widely adopted, they're also emerging as promising platforms where people are coming and self-disclosing about a variety of stigmatizing concerns. And the one that we are interested in here is mental illness. So in this work, we asked a set of questions, which are as follows. First of all, we wanted to know what kinds of behavioral changes precede and follow such disclosures that happen online. The second question we ask is, do the therapeutic benefits of essentially opening up, do these manifest in the changes that we see on social media? And then how do we answer those questions? So in this work, we address these questions by focusing on disclosures of schizophrenia diagnoses that were made by people voluntarily on the Twitter platform. So we adopted a clinically grounded quantitative approach here, and we quantified behaviors both before and after these self-disclosures of schizophrenia diagnosis. And we found that indeed, there were many distinct linguistic differences before and after these disclosures. Let's start with one measure, which is a measure of coherence. Coherency is often one of the measures that clinicians would look out for in individuals struggling with schizophrenia. What we find is that if we look at coherency in social media speak following this disclosure, we get a heat map that looks like the one that you see on the slide. This heat map shows the average coherence value per user per day. The figure reveals essentially some sort of a gradual increase in topical coherence for most users following the disclosure, which is shown by the vertical black dotted line in the middle. What this means is that this increase in coherency is indicative of feeling better. And if we look at the literature in psychotherapy, we would notice that self-disclosure is often known to help people organize and remember events better in a more coherent fashion, while it also allows them to integrate their thoughts and feelings into those descriptions. So what we are saying is that these self-disclosures that are happening on social media, they are actually helping people think more coherently, and that's a positive thing. Let's look at one more measure here, and that is of readability. And what we find from the very left figure here is that readability increases following a social media disclosure. So again, if we look at the literature, we would find that reorganizing and structuring traumatic memories or experiences can be very helpful because it can help in developing a complex and coherent narrative for a person. And because we see readability to improve after disclosure, it means that when people self-disclose about their diagnosis on the Twitter platform, we are noticing evidence of, let's say, things like reduced sentence framing limitations once the self-disclosure happens. And again, that is a positive outcome resulting from the self-disclosure. Next measure, we also find that there is an increasing trend in word complexity as is measured by the normalized lengths of words in the Twitter postings of people. Looking at prior work says that people with schizophrenia are often limited in their ability to think with any degree of complexity, unfortunately. The evidence of emergence of complexity in the language of these Twitter users, for that reason, it means that it reveals a reduction of a very important negative symptom of schizophrenia. And then finally, moving to the very right of this of the slide, let us look at the repeatability measure, which is measured as the proportion of non-unique words that are shared in any Twitter posting. And what we see here is that repeatability decreases following the self-disclosure. So again, when we think about individuals suffering from schizophrenia, they are not known to have repetitive thoughts that interfere with their ability to think. So this reduction in word repeatability that we're observing in Twitter writing is probably indicative of better articulation via language among the expressions of these individuals, as well as it also probably means that these individuals are able to engage in more concrete thinking and functioning following that disclosure on the platform. So now taking it all together, all of these patterns indicate that the positive effects of self-disclosure that we know exist in the offline world actually exist in the online world as well. When people appropriate a platform like Twitter to talk about very deep-seated stigmatizing feelings like the experience of a mental illness, it does lead to positive outcomes. But the benefits of social media are not just limited to creating some sort of a safe space for stigmatizing mental health disclosures. It goes much beyond that. There are dedicated online communities, we know, that cater to the needs of many individuals who seek maybe anonymous or pseudonymous help and advice about their mental health challenges from other empathetic peers. We investigated this angle in the work that you see up on the slide. And what we did was that we wanted to know what is the role of online social support in future risk to suicidal ideation. So to answer that question, what we did was we examined publicly shared longitudinal post and comment data on a number of prominent mental health communities on the social news platform called Reddit. We then identified individuals in this data who proceeded to post on a dedicated Reddit suicide support forum called Suicide Watch at a later point in time. So when we used comments received on posts in these communities as sort of a proxy for social support, we found that indeed social media was having positive impact. How did we arrive at that conclusion? We arrived at the conclusion by developing a human-machine hybrid statistical methodology that modeled and quantified the effects of language in these comments among individuals who did and did not post on the suicide support forum. More specifically, what we did was we applied some methods from the causal inference literature, particularly stratified propensity score matching in an iterative fashion, where we then first identified comparable subpopulations of individuals and measured their effect on social support, effect of social support language on their future risk of suicidal ideation. We then interpreted these linguistic cues with established theoretical model of social support. So let me unpack the findings a bit more for you. First of all, the biggest finding for us was that, probably expectedly, not all individuals who posted on Reddit mental health communities were equally likely to be influenced by social support received through comments. So who did benefit from these comments? Those who benefited from this tended to show greater social and futuristic orientation, greater interpersonal awareness, and lower cognitive impairment in their writings. But the bigger finding here was that we found linguistic features that were used to provide certain kinds of social support tended to be positively or negatively associated with future suicidal ideation. So if you look at the linguistic features that appeared in esteem or network support, these tended to reduce one's risk to suicidal ideation in the future. So these were good sources of social support. But surprisingly, we did find that not all support are good. In fact, certain kinds of support can actually be harmful to people. So we found that language that was associated with interpersonal acknowledgements, those tended to be significantly counter-beneficial to people. What these findings tell us is that the impacts of online commentary on future mental health can be profound. But this work also tells us that how can we think about designing tools that can harness the positives of the certain types of social support that we tend to see to help people, while also suppressing some of the negative forms of support that exacerbate somebody's mental health in these online communities. However, unlike online support communities, where we are seeing that there is an audience and that audience comprises sympathetic peers with similar experiences, there is a deeper question here, which is what a mental health disclosure gains from sort of like an invisible audience on a general purpose public social media platform. And we don't quite understand that. Why would someone go to a platform, let's say like Twitter, which doesn't necessarily cater to mental health needs of people? Why do people go there to these platforms and these mechanisms of disclosure, and what do they gain out of it, if they gain anything out of it? So to investigate that, we again looked at people who self-disclosed their diagnosis of schizophrenia on Twitter, and we performed a rich temporal analysis of over 400 disclosures and their nearly 400,000 audiences. First, when we characterized and modeled audience engagement temporally, we found evidence of temporal and topical reciprocity in the interactions between the disclosures and their audiences. And you would expect that to see in an online community. But what was interesting was that it wasn't the notion of an online community here. It was a general purpose social media platform. Then in relation to the disclosures data, we also found that the audience in these general purpose platforms, they engaged in ways that indicated discussions around mental health resources, fighting stigma, providing emotional support, and providing tips on better everyday functioning. So we wanted to understand these findings through a theoretical lens from social science. And for that, we drew upon the social penetration theory, and we operationalized the disclosure process as a form of disclosure of intimacy. We quantified that measure of intimacy, and we built an autoregressive time series model that would indicate that we found to indicate that the patterns of audience engagement and content tended to indicate certain temporal variabilities. So if we look at the number of mentions received by a disclosure, if we look at the themes related to emotional support and discussions of personal private life, if these themes were present in the conversations and exchanges between a disclosure and an audience, we found that it forecasted more intimate discussions going forward. So what this work tells us is that it sheds new light into the positive role of sort of this invisible audience on public social media platforms, and how even this nebulous invisible audience can have important positive role in supporting the needs of people with stigmatizing conditions and experiences such as mental illness. All right, so we are at a point where we have seen quite a few examples, positive examples of social media helping people. But if we were thinking that there is actually no trouble in paradise or social media here, we would obviously be gravely wrong. So let's now turn our attention to how social media can also end up hurting mental health. And here I will highlight two works where the same types of platforms and the same types of affordances that helped some people with their mental health tended to also undermine other people's mental well-being. So let us revisit online communities. We just discussed how these forums can be incredibly helpful in supplementing and augmenting people's interpersonal communications and can provide a sense of belonging. And all of these are key to better mental health. But unfortunately, we also have plenty of communities online where the benefits are not so glaring. Just take the example of pro-eating disorder behaviors and the resulting communities, often written in the media as pro-ANA communities. So what are pro-ANA communities? Pro-ANA communities are groups that legitimize unusually restricted eating and excessive exercise to promote a normative body weight and shape. in a way that adopting or encouraging these strategies are a lifestyle choice rather than a mental health condition. So, in the light of a lot of backlash that happened because of the existence of pro-Ana communities, about 10 years ago, the popular social media platform Instagram took a measure. They ended up banning a number of hashtags on pro-eating disorders and pro-self-harm. By banning, what Instagram did it was that it wasn't preventing people from using those banned hashtags, but what it meant is that if somebody searched on those banned hashtags, either they wouldn't get any results or they would get a content advisory like the one that you see in the screenshot up on the slide. But the question is, if these negative effects could be curbed by these simple blanket interventions or these kinds of banning, then we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So the question from a more empirical perspective is that did this banning policy help people or not? This is what we investigated in this work. And the short answer is that unfortunately, the banning not only not help people, but actually it led to counter-beneficial outcomes. So while it may seem like a nice idea on the surface, looking under the hood at the very design of these platforms reveals how ineffective these intervention policies can be and how these platforms, in this case, actually continue to be a thriving ground of arguably more extreme pro-eating disorder content. How did we arrive at the conclusion? We studied this through an examination of the emergence and substantial adoption of lexical variant tags. And these are tags that emerged after banning and content moderation was enforced by Instagram back in April 2012. Although in this work, we do not work on deriving a causal relationship, but what we observe is that even with this intervention, we found that pro-eating disorder communities continue to thrive on this platform through the use of these lexical variant tags. In fact, on an average, there was a 70% decrease in proportion of variant tags compared to that of the root tag. But then there was also increased activity showing that the pro-eating disorder community continued to thrive, even though the overall participation on certain tags dropped after the banning. Overall, this work of us tells us of a deliberate strategy by the pro-eating disorder community to circumvent content moderation policies and to continue to organize and sustain themselves. Not just that, we found that these communities that use these lexical variant tags, they showed increased participation and support of pro-eating disorder behavior. And this was measured through the number of likes and comments that these variant tags got. That's what you see in the slides, in the tables on the slide. So unpacking these numbers here, we find that the mean number of likes and variant tags was higher by 30% compared to the root tags, root postings, which had the banned tags. And similarly, comments, they were 15% higher in the variant tag containing posts compared to the root tag containing posts. So despite the content moderation efforts of Instagram, what it seems like is that there is continued support in the pro-eating disorder community around these lexical variant tags. Then we had additional findings. We found that the tags that were associated with content on these variants, they expressed more toxic, self-harm, and vulnerable content. For instance, a lot of them contained tags that had a tone of self-loathing or self-harm. We believe that it may come from the community's constant dissatisfaction and discomfort with their objective sense of physical appearance and attributes. Self-harm, in fact, takes such thoughts and emotions to a very extreme. But these tags also describe depression and other reduced self-esteem related aspects more dramatically than the postings that were associated with the banned root tags. So to sum it up, what this tells us is that these distinctive patterns, they indicate a tendency of the variant communities to adopt these lexical variants probably as a way to circumvent, to subvert Instagram's attention on sharing of triggering self-harm and vulnerable content. And basically what this means is that despite these modern strategies, pro-eating disorder communities were active and thriving, and these platforms continued to be bad for the mental health of individuals in these communities. And as the Wired article here rightly said, it was just not working, but Instagram's ban actually made the problem worse. And this is a prime example of how, despite good intentions, platforms can end up hurting people and exacerbating their mental health. So now here is one more example. If we think about today's social media sites, they're not just places we go to socialize, but these are also places where we stay connected about the world, about small and big happenings. And one type of event where these platforms are particularly catering to the dissemination of information and raising awareness is around crisis. But this means crisis in today's digital age, they are no longer just affecting the direct victims of the crisis, but also the varied information, particularly misleading information that circulates widely on the web. It impacts people indirectly, probably in much larger numbers, through protracted and perpetual exposure. And what could be a better example of that other than the COVID-19 crisis? But how does exposure to or consumption of online misinformation impact our mental well-being? This is a piece that we don't quite understand very well. That's what we investigated in this work. We answered this question through a large-scale observational study that was based on a propensity score matching causal framework that spanned over 80 million Twitter postings that were made by close to 80,000 Twitter users during the first 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. We found that users who shared COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter, they experienced approximately 2 times additional increase in their anxiety levels when compared to other people who did not share COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter. But what was most interesting to us were the sociodemographic differences. We found that across sociodemographic attributes, female users, racial minorities, and people with lower levels of education in the US, they experienced a disproportionately higher increase in anxiety levels when compared to their social media peers. So our findings here allowed us to quantify for the first time the harms of online misinformation as it relates to an individual's mental health. With half of adults in the US and millions of adults throughout the world today getting their news primarily on social media, and with more misinformation thriving on these platforms than ever, we have new challenges to tackle today, which is to seek to moderate and counter misinformation. We not only have to think about how to correct misinformation, but also we need to think about how resources may be allocated to individuals who are particularly vulnerable to misinformation as we see on social media. All right, so far we have seen quite a few examples where social media is benefiting people's mental health, but others where it is not. And in fact, it could be damaging to their mental health. So you must be wondering, what is sort of the right answer to this question that I posed earlier on in the talk? Now that you've seen some evidence on both sides of the aisle, you're probably thinking, wow, this sounds very complicated. And that feeling, you wouldn't be wrong in thinking so. Why is it complicated? It is complicated because whether social media is good or bad for mental health isn't something that just varies by population, by context, by the platform under consideration, or the type of use. It is complicated also because for the same person or same community, this technology can have varied, sometimes opposing impact on the individual. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll give you some examples of that. The first one deals with digital help as well as harm that may result from social media use during management of mental health recovery. So we again think about people diagnosed with mental health conditions. Psychiatric hospitalizations constitute a major life transition because it involves clinical treatment, crisis stabilization, and it also unfortunately includes loss of access to social networks and technology. So the period after hospitalization for a person, it involves not just management of the condition and clinical recovery, but it also means the person now has to reestablish their social connections and has to get back to social and vocational roles for successful reintegration into the society. And today, a significant portion of this is being mediated by social technologies like social media. But little is known about how people get back to their social lives after a psychiatric hospitalization and the role that social technology plays during this reintegration process. This is the gap we address in this work, and we do that through an interview study with 19 consented adults, 63% of which of who were women, and who experienced a psychiatric hospitalization related to a mood or a psychotic disorder in the recent past. We examined the interview data adopting a hybrid inductive and deductive approach to thematic analysis, and we discovered a variety of different themes that were related to role of social technologies in supporting as well as hindering reintegration efforts. Here are some of our findings. We found that participants' social lives after hospitalization were deeply intertwined with factors linked to self-management of the mental health condition, as well as on stigma, inhibitions, and over-reliance on others after the hospitalization had happened. We identified different approaches that people adopted to reestablish their social connections, both online and offline, immediately after discharge from the hospital. And these were driven by a sense of urgency, obligation, and stigma. Importantly, also because social media and social technology are such an important part of people's life that the post-discharge period meant that they needed to come up to speed on their activity on these technologies. We also found that social technology platforms, they mediated participants' interactions after the hospitalization. Social media in particular provided spaces for disclosure, social support, and they were sources for positive behavior change. A common theme across post-discharge goals that people set for themselves was that they were actively identifying and addressing daily stressors in their lives. And they were making positive behavioral changes to better manage their condition. And social media helped identify those stressors that lay online. But beyond the individual's role in managing their mental health condition outside the hospital, we also found that social connections played an important role. For instance, family members, friends, and importantly, online social connections, they together played a very important role in supporting the person's reintegration efforts. But outside of active interactions with people and content online, social media had another advantage for these individuals. Participants in our study mentioned the many benefits that they drew from just simply passive consumption of social media, such as scrolling, viewing videos, and otherwise consuming interesting information on the internet. So while participants drew several social benefits from social technology use, some did feel that their use of these platforms actually hindered their path to reintegration because of feelings of social comparison, negative interactions, and emotional triggers that brought up their mental health symptoms. For instance, some participants in our study found that they were spending too much time online on these platforms, and this was replacing the time that they would otherwise spend on social interactions in person. And we know that in-person interactions often are likely to be richer and more nourishing following a major life event. Participants in our study, they also described seeing other people's postings about doing well in life. And when they saw that, they felt less accomplished or they felt bad about themselves, especially given the backdrop of their own history of having experienced a psychotic episode and having been hospitalized. Some actually said that the information they consumed online was stress-inducing, and it triggered their mental health symptoms instead of alleviating them. In fact, there was one participant in our study who spoke about the negative effects of consuming certain types of information online, and they said that this was actually not helping their recovery or reintegration journeys at all. This person was hospitalized in 2020, And he said that he had to deactivate his social media account after he was discharged because he did not wish to see social media posts about the California wildfires or COVID-19 related deaths that were happening throughout the world, as it was affecting his moods and mental health in a negative way. So, by investigating the social lives of people after psychiatric hospitalization, what this work tells us is that it tells us about these people's shifting goals, priorities, and challenges during the process of reintegration. And it helps us unpack how online social lives are deeply intertwined with the management of illness, sometimes for positive outcomes and sometimes for negative ones. What was interesting to us was that despite knowing the harmful effects, only a few people adopted practices like blocking, unfriending, or reconfiguring their social technologies, such as Facebook's newsfeed settings, to counteract the negative outcomes. This means that platform designers have a lot to do here. They need to better account for these negative effects by providing people with more agency and control in configuring their information feeds and recommendation. So what could this look like? This could include features, for instance, for controlling how much a person sees a specific kind of content on their feeds. Platforms can design maybe algorithmic marketplaces, which would provide a suite of content ranking and recommendation algorithms to its users, and users can select the desired ones based on their particular life circumstances, such as the aftermath of a hospitalization. Similarly, other features could be used. For instance, existing features for blocking, taking a break from other people's content, unfollowing, etc. These could be made more apparent and easily accessible to people by providing maybe feature guides or recommending or providing tutorials on their use. Together, what this work tells us is that putting people in the center, factoring in the heterogeneity of their needs and experiences, understanding the importance of interrelationships over time, sensitivity towards their shifting goals and priorities, paying attention to transformation in their social lives, both online and offline, all of these are really important for social media platforms to consider to ensure that they can enable positive uses of the platform while also curbing the negative impacts following an unfortunate mental health episode. So now turning to the second example here, in this work, we focus again on both the harm and harm reduction that may follow the appropriation of online communities that discuss stigmatizing experiences like substance misuse. Beyond mental illness, one unique thing about social media is that it has emerged as places for support around substance misuse recovery experiences as well, not just about mental health. For a lot of these conditions, such as opioid misuse, which is considered an epidemic today in the United States, plenty of research shows that individuals are turning online to promote recovery efforts. But in an unregulated and less moderated space like this, some online communities may actually be promoting clinically unverified methods to ameliorate withdrawal symptoms of substance misuse or manage detoxification as approaches to recovery. So the use of alternative treatments for substance misuse recovery isn't a new thing, but it remains both controversial and poorly understood from a clinical perspective. Some report successful amelioration of withdrawal symptoms, while others report physical dependence and dangerous side effects that result from the use of these alternative approaches. So in this work, we examined how social media platforms are being used for discussions around these type of alternative treatments around opioid misuse. For this, we applied recent advances in natural language processing, particularly lexicosemantic embeddings of posts shared on Reddit's many opioid use recovery forums, and then we applied its expert human annotations on them. In this way, in this work, we sought to get a more comprehensive view and understanding of social media in management of substance misuse. Here, as one of the many findings, we highlight a known alternative treatment that was prominently discussed in these Reddit communities, and that was the use of the substance kratom. On one hand, many users in these communities reported successful tapering off of opioids, like from heroin and fentanyl. And they said that how kratom assisted them with managing their withdrawal symptoms, as you can read from the first quote in the slide. On the other hand, there were many users who reported that they started misusing kratom as well as a replacement for opioids during their self-initiated recovery efforts, and that you can read from the second quote on the slide. We know that there was even a subreddit that was created to facilitate recovery from kratom in our data set called r/quitting kratom. Others describe their difficulties in reducing use of kratom and comparisons to other kinds of opioid withdrawal, and that you can read in the third quote here. Next, as another finding, we notice the trend of users creating sort of these stacks or these kits of many substances as a comprehensive alternative treatment for opioid misuse recovery. These users elaborately said that they were combining prescription drugs, illicit drugs, over-the-counter medications, vitamins and minerals, and other substances to ameliorate their symptoms. And you can read that in the first quote. Along these lines, we find that there were even users who described the specific dosing patterns and timings of usage of these kits to alleviate their struggles, and recommended that as a path to recovery from opioid misuse. And yet, there were other people in these forums who reported combining substances all at once to tackle their challenges. You can read that in the second quote here. Overall, we note here that mixing drugs is being promoted on these platforms, but we know that this actually may lead to unintended interaction and could actually amplify overdose risk if relapse occurs. So to summarize here, what we did was we used advances in deep neural learning and human annotation to identify first a list of potential alternative treatments in opioid misuse recovery. And we found that our analysis reveals that social media tends to be spaces where users report both successes as well as risks with their usage of these alternative treatments when it comes to managing withdrawal. Broadly speaking, we see this work as showcasing potential harm reduction efforts in substance misuse. And the reason is we discovered users reporting dependence on certain alternative treatments. And in some cases, interactions between alternative treatments were reported to be struggling and outright dangerous. But after all, these users are attempting to reduce the dependence on opioids, and that's a positive thing. So even if these alternative approaches are clinically unverified or potentially dangerous, these behaviors essentially represent efforts at harm reduction. So recognizing these behaviors can be a very important step to promote safer drug use, and social media can play a key role here. So I'll begin to wrap up here. So hopefully the series of studies I just described paint a very complex picture about the role of social media and mental health. There cannot be a blanket answer of yes or no, as if you read media or popular discourse, it often tries to make you believe. So now whether social media helps or it hurts really depends on a number of factors, as you just saw today in the talk. And it is not just dependent upon who uses it, when, and for how long. Again, that's the simplistic picture that we are often told in news media. But rather, the real answer depends upon the how. To understand the impacts, we need to unpack and delve into the characteristics of use and look at mental well-being and mental health from many diverse perspectives. Understanding people's needs are also important, and so is what experience and stage of life circumstances, what kind of social media might be beneficial or harmful. That is an equally important piece to consider. For instance, we found different roles that social media can play for individuals recovering from opioid misuse and those who experienced a psychiatric hospitalization. Importantly, the norms of a platform or community we found were additionally dictating who and what forms of benefits and harm were even possible, as we saw was the case for individuals looking for mental health support online before they felt suicidal, or those who looked to open up about their diagnosis on social media. At the same time, we have to recognize that the answer to this question is also impacted by the design and affordances of the platforms themselves, as was the case for the pro-eating disorder communities or the case of COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter. So the real question here is, now that we recognize the contrasting picture, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough to amplify the good and address the bad? I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that some platforms are at least trying to make an attempt to this regard. For instance, in response to people sharing suicide and self-harm content, Tumblr has been known to issue public service announcements. So these contain links to helplines and resources for mental health literacy, for raising awareness, and for fighting stigma. You can see some examples up on the slide. Facebook similarly has been developing an AI for suicide prevention, wherein they're computationally analyzing private conversations on Facebook Messenger to identify and intervene during opportune moments of crisis. These are commendable efforts, right? But there is still a lot to do, as you can see from the different projects we discussed today. One of the biggest risks are social media platforms' algorithmic recommendation and information curation systems, such as the Facebook newsfeed. These systems essentially find similar content to a user's posting history or their social ties with other users. However, when these systems suggest content that promote or glorify damaging behaviors, such behaviors gets reinforced to these vulnerable individuals, and that can have a negative impact on their mental health. With appropriate modification to the recommendation algorithms, though, platforms could limit the exposure of harmful content, whether misinformation or unsupportive content from others. Instead, platforms could also introduce supportive, caring, and empathetic, recovery-oriented content in the suggested recommendations and to disseminate information to aid recovery. But aside from fixing what is broken, which is what we have discussed so far, a complementary question could also be, there are indeed some positives happening, and how can the positive feedback be reinforced on these platforms? In other words, how can we learn from the benefits that the platforms are already offering to make it reach a much wider population? For instance, if self-disclosure has therapeutic gains on a person's mental health, can we design these platforms to make disclosure processes easier? Probably this could be thinking about journaling features or features that would enable people to self-reflect on their recovery journeys, on their experiences, on their positive feelings and events, and able to amplify and reinforce those positive facets of their life. Ultimately, there is no denying the fact that social media platforms in particular and web in general have critically shaped our world today. And there are many outcomes that we are grateful for, as web's creator, Tim Berners-Lee, also acknowledges in this quote. But clearly, we have a lot more work to do if we want social media platforms to be a force for good. And as technologists and researchers, that onus is upon us. So instead of shunning social media, as many individuals tend to advocate as a solution, it is our moment to redefine and think about what these platforms could look like going forward so that their proliferating, intertwining in our lives is meaningful and nourishing and not strangling our mental health, as was once said by one of my study participants. With that, I come to an end to this talk. Thank you very much for listening. I thank all my students and collaborators for contributing to the work and for the sponsors for supporting this research. I think I have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. De Choudhury. We learned a lot from your talk. I think it's very enlightening and it's very informative. So now let's open the floor. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat thread, or you can just open your microphone and you can directly ask online. Perhaps can I take the privilege and ask Dr. Choudhury the first question? I think a very, very fascinating work. You're really doing fascinating work. It was not long ago, we came across your piece, like using Reddit data. You're trying to classify the levels of disclosure content in terms of mental health discussion. If I remember correctly, you use like Reddit data. So I was just wondering, have you done similar analysis applying this method to other sorts of digital trace data other than Reddit data? And what is the finding? And I was just wondering whether this kind of levels of disclosure, they can vary a lot just by the platform.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we did look at Twitter and Reddit as the two platforms where people self-disclose about their mental illness. Of course, it is a bit different in the platforms because, as you heard in the talk, one has dedicated communities for mental health support, which is Reddit, and then Twitter is more of a general purpose platform. We found that there were some commonalities and also some differences across these disclosures. Reddit, because of its nature that it is a support forum, these self-disclosures tended to get more directed support from the audience. But on Twitter, we found that when people self-disclosed, there were more subtle engagement indicators around those disclosures, such as people liking or retweeting these kinds of content without necessarily explicitly providing social support. So definitely, the platform affordances matter a lot, but at least across two platforms, we do see that self-disclosures tend to have a positive impact on people. So now, there could be other platforms where actually self-disclosures don't help. And that'll be an interesting future direction to explore. For instance, are there certain platforms that do not encourage these kinds of disclosures? And I'll be very curious to investigate what kind of pushback do people get when they try to engage in these kind of sensitive conversations on those platforms.
Very, very interesting. And also it reminds me, I think, can I just ask a very quick question? Because just now in your talk, you mentioned like the audience engagement. So I was just wondering, you use like linguistic expressions to explore this audience engagement?
Yeah, that is correct. We've largely looked at linguistic factors, but we also looked at simple volumes like, are people liking these a lot? Are people commenting a lot on these? Is the reciprocity? Because reciprocity is considered a positive thing. When one person discloses, does the other person come back and also self-disclose about their own experiences or not? So we looked at some structural attributes as well.
Interesting. That's reciprocal disclosure. Very interesting.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's a question from Adrian in the chat box.
Should I look at that?
Yeah, so I can read it for you. It's thank you for that enriching presentation. I'm curious to know what are the concerns when it comes to the invasion of privacy in social media intervening to address a mental health crisis. Example, Facebook trying to intervene to prevent suicidal motives?
Yeah, it is a very thorny issue, as you rightly said. Privacy concerns are tremendous. And the way Facebook is doing it, there are lots of issues with that because most people have not consented to their, Facebook posts being monitored this way for suicidal motives. So even though Facebook may have positive intentions in wanting to help people during these moments of crisis, but it can take people by surprise and not in a good way. There is also the question of what is the best way to intervene, right? What should you do when Facebook discovers somebody is at risk of suicide? What should they do, given that Facebook is is a company. It is not a crisis counselor. It is not a therapist. So what is the right thing to do? And there are lots of privacy related questions around that as well, because for a lot of platforms, and I'm not sure what exactly Facebook does, no one really knows. It's an internal proprietary algorithm. But a lot of the concerns here is in the involvement of law enforcement or police. And policing of mental health concerns, we know, is not a good thing, as it will prevent people from speaking up about their mental health. It will increase the stigma around mental illness. So it matters a lot from a privacy perspective also what is being done after it is identified that somebody holds suicidal motives. And that is the second part of the thorniness on the issue. I think if we think about a path forward, a better strategy would be to understand what is it that people want during these moments. Do people want to be contacted at all? How do we identify who wants to be contacted, who doesn't want to be contacted? And not just that, who wants to be contacted, how do they want to be contacted? Should the intervention look like the involvement of law enforcement? Should it involve the involvement of friends and family or some other mechanism? We have to do a lot of foundational work there in order to meet those privacy challenges.
Thank you. So I think there is also a question from Anilesh. One of your suggestions is perhaps social media platforms could expose people to sympathetic content rather than potentially damaging content. Are we missing the bigger picture that is the root cause of mental illness and too much expecting from social media platforms?
Well, I don't think we're expecting too much from social media platforms because they're barely doing anything at the moment. If you ask me, that's my personal opinion. I think these platforms do have a social responsibility of doing something for their users, who basically are their products, because these companies thrive on the data that we share on these platforms. So I think they do have a social responsibility of doing something. I think definitely the root cause of mental health, I agree with you, needs to be investigated. Unfortunately, sometimes, as you heard from this talk, the root cause lies within the social media platforms themselves. Of course, not always. It can be elsewhere. It could be amplified. And as you saw in the talk, sometimes actually social media platforms could help people. So we have to acknowledge that as well. But whatever the root cause is, I think social media platforms do have a responsibility to take care of people. If there are damaging information that are being shared on these platforms, they do have a role to play in keeping the environment of these platforms safe and healthy in a way that actually helps people without shooing them away from the platform, such as what a banning would do. Banning is a band-aid, essentially, right? Because banning makes the problem go away without actually solving anything. And the study on Instagram hopefully made that point, is that it actually doesn't even make the problem go away. It ends up hurting people more going forward. So yes, platforms have to do something, but it needs to be deeper, more thoughtful solutions rather than band-aid blanket solutions like banning.
Thank you. There's another question from Baiqi. Thanks for your insightful talk. I wonder how you identify the self-disclosure and social support posts. Would you mind sharing more details about it?
Yeah, the self-disclosure process was pretty straightforward. We essentially did a regular expression lookup of people who basically said they had been diagnosed with a particular mental illness, or they have been suffering from a particular mental illness, and variants of that. For social support, we used a supervised learning approach. We essentially had human annotations on comments that were informational, emotional. In one case, we also looked at other kinds of support, and then we built a classifier on the language of those comments in order to assess the level of social support. We particularly used a theoretical framework called the Social Support Behavioral Code, which is a framework that comes from the social science literature as a way to identify those types of social support and the attributes of what constitutes, let's say, emotional or esteem support in particular.
Very interesting. Thank you. If no more questions, I think here we'd like to express our sincere thanks again to Dr. De Choudhury for the very fantastic talk. I think a lot of rich contents to digest today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for the great questions that you all had. And, my email is up on the slide. So is my Twitter. If anybody wants to reach out with any questions that you haven't had a chance to come up with at the moment, but if it crosses your mind later on, you can always reach out to me. Thank you, Celine and Eve and others for hosting me at a short time frame. And hopefully I'll get a chance to interact with you all another time in another format.
Yeah, then we warmly welcome you to visit us in person. Yeah.
Thank you.